The mahogany conference table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights as Marcus Sterling, CEO of Meridian Financial Group, stood at its head, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his face twisted in what he probably thought was righteous indignation. 40 pairs of eyes darted between him and me, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Miss Sullivan," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who enjoyed public displays of power. "Your recent actions have forced my hand. The board agrees that your methods are too risky for a company of our standing." I sat there, perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the leather portfolio in front of me. Inside that portfolio were documents that would make his world collapse in exactly 3 days. But for now, I simply listened. "You're terminated, effective immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the room. After all, I was Emma Sullivan, the woman who had saved Meridian Financial Group from 3 potential disasters in the past year alone. The risk management director who had turned their struggling portfolio into a fortress. The person who had just prevented a $50 million loss last week. But Marcus Sterling didn't care about any of that. He only cared about control, about showing everyone that he was in charge. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had seen this coming months ago, and I had prepared accordingly. I stood slowly, gathering my things with deliberate calm. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said quietly, my voice steady. Then I walked out, heels clicking against the marble floor, leaving behind a room full of stunned faces and whispered conversations. It was exactly 9:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and phase 1 of my plan was complete. 6 months earlier, the first time I realized Marcus Sterling would try to destroy me was during a routine budget meeting. I had just presented a new risk management strategy that would save the company millions in unnecessary hedging costs. The data was solid, the math impeccable, but Marcus's eyes had narrowed in that peculiar way that meant he felt threatened. "That's quite ambitious, Emma," he said, emphasizing my first name like it was a weapon. "Perhaps a bit too ambitious for someone at your level." I had been at Meridian for 7 years by then, brought in during the financial crisis when they desperately needed someone who understood both risk and innovation. I had delivered, consistently and brilliantly, turning their risk management division from a corporate afterthought into the company's backbone. But Marcus had only been CEO for 8 months, brought in by a board that wanted a dynamic leader for their public image. He had the right pedigree, the right connections, the right look. What he didn't have was any real understanding of how financial risk actually worked. That day, watching him dismiss my strategy without even understanding it, I made a decision. I would protect myself quietly and thoroughly because men like Marcus Sterling didn't fire people. They destroyed them. I began by documenting everything. Every email, every meeting, every decision. I created encrypted backups of all my risk analyses, storing them securely off-site. But more importantly, I started laying the groundwork for something bigger. You see, Meridian's entire operation depended on their credit lines. Without them, the company's daily operations would grind to a halt. The biggest of these, a $50 million revolving credit facility, was coming up for renewal. Marcus, focused on his public appearances and corporate politics, had delegated the renewal process entirely to my department. What he didn't bother to read in the paperwork was that the renewal wasn't just a simple extension. It required a complete restructuring with new terms, new guarantees, and most importantly, new ownership of the special purpose vehicle that actually held the credit facility. I spent 3 months quietly negotiating with Somerset Bank, building relationships, explaining my methodology. They understood what Marcus never could, that true financial security came from understanding risk, not avoiding it. When they offered to let me take personal ownership of the SPV that would hold the credit line, I accepted with a small smile. The paperwork was complex, deliberately so. Buried in hundreds of pages of legal language was the simple fact that I, through a series of perfectly legal corporate structures, would effectively control Meridian's financial lifeline. Marcus signed off on it without reading past the first page, too busy preparing for another TV interview about his innovative leadership. Meanwhile, I continued to excel at my job, much to Marcus's growing discomfort. I prevented a massive loss during a market downturn in March. I restructured our Asian exposure to avoid currency risks. I built systems that caught trading errors before they could become disasters. Each success made Marcus more uneasy. He started excluding me from key meetings, removed me from copied emails, had his assistant accidentally leave me off calendar invites. Classic signs of a CEO preparing to remove someone he saw as a threat. The final straw came last week. Our trading desk had taken a massive position in emerging market derivatives, authorized directly by Marcus without consulting risk management. When the markets turned against us, we were looking at a potential $50 million loss. I spent 48 hours straight at my desk, analyzing patterns, running scenarios, building hedges. In the end, I not only prevented the loss but managed to turn it into a small profit. The traders called it brilliant. The risk management team called it inspired. Marcus called it unnecessarily complicated and dangerously aggressive. That's when I knew my time was running out. I could see it in the way he stalked the halls, in the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, in the sudden requests for detailed reports on all my methodologies. So I prepared. I updated all my documentation. I confirmed my control of the credit facility. I made sure every single action I had taken was not only legal but provably necessary for the company's survival. Then I waited. The email came last night. Mandatory all-hands meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. No agenda. No explanation. Classic ambush tactic. I arrived early, dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit that had cost me a month's salary. Image matters in finance, especially when you're about to let someone underestimate you for the last time. The room filled quickly. Department heads, senior managers, even some junior staff. Marcus wanted an audience for this. He wanted to make an example of me. I watched him stride in at exactly 9 a.m., flanked by 2 security guards and someone from HR. He didn't even try to make it look professional. No private conversation, no dignified exit. He wanted a show. And now here I was, walking out of Meridian Financial Group for what they thought was the last time. Security escort behind me, cardboard box in my arms for theatrical effect. Anything important had been removed days ago. Employees peeking out from behind their monitors to watch my walk of shame. I kept my head high, my pace steady. The security guard, Jim, who had always been kind to me, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Miss Sullivan," he whispered as we reached the lobby. "This isn't right." I gave him a small smile. "Don't worry, Jim. Everything happens for a reason." Outside, the city bustled under a clear autumn sky. I took a deep breath of crisp October air and checked my watch. 9:47 a.m. In exactly 3 days, Marcus Sterling would learn what real risk looked like. But for now, I had a breakfast meeting to attend with the CFO of Somerset Bank, who was very interested in hearing about my sudden availability. I slipped into the back of my waiting car, not a taxi, but a private town car I had arranged the night before. Image matters in finance, after all, especially when you're about to turn from fired employee to the person who holds your former company's financial fate in your hands. The driver pulled away from the curb smoothly as I pulled out my phone. A text from my lawyer confirmed that everything was in place. Another from my private banker assured me that my own finances were secure and untouchable. I leaned back against the leather seat, allowing myself a moment to appreciate the perfect execution of Phase 1. Marcus thought he had won. He thought he had proven his power, established his dominance, eliminated a threat. What he had actually done was activate a sequence of events that would teach him the true meaning of risk management. Because while he had been focused on his public image, I had been focused on something far more important, understanding exactly how power really worked in the world of high finance. And in 3 days, when Somerset Bank's statement revealed exactly who controlled Meridian's critical credit line, Marcus Sterling would learn that sometimes the biggest risk is underestimating the person you're trying to destroy. But that was Phase 2. For now, I had a breakfast meeting to attend and a story to begin telling. After all, timing is everything in finance. And my timing was perfect. The Somerset Bank executive dining room had that particular kind of hushed elegance that only old money could create. Crystal glasses caught the morning light, white tablecloths draped with mathematical precision, and the subtle scent of fresh coffee mixed with power and privilege. William Hayes, CFO of Somerset Bank, stood as I approached the corner table. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "Emma," he said warmly, "I heard about this morning's theatrics at Meridian." I settled into the leather chair across from him, accepting a cup of perfectly brewed coffee from a discreet waiter. News travels fast in financial circles. especially when someone makes a mistake as colossal as Marcus Sterling just did. William's eyes sparkled with a mixture of amusement and anticipation. I assume everything is proceeding according to plan? I took a small sip of coffee, savoring the moment. Phase 1 is complete. Marcus did exactly what we expected. Made it public, made it dramatic, made it impossible to quietly reverse course. William nodded, pulling out a sleek leather portfolio. Our timing couldn't be better. The quarterly review of all major credit facilities is scheduled for Friday morning. Marcus will be required to attend personally as CEO. And the documentation. All in order. The ownership structure of the SPV controlling their credit line will be revealed as part of standard compliance protocols. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. I must admit, I'm looking forward to seeing his face when he realizes what he's done. I reached into my bag and retrieved a USB drive. This contains detailed reports of every risk management decision I've made in the past year, including a full analysis of last week's derivatives save. Your risk committee might find it interesting reading. William pocketed the drive smoothly. I'm sure they will. Now, shall we discuss your future role at Somerset? The rest of breakfast passed in a comfortable discussion of possibilities. By the time I left, I had a verbal offer to become Somerset's new head of strategic risk management at triple my Meridian salary. But that would come later. For now, there was work to be done. Back in my car, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Meridian's HR department, 5 from their legal team, and 1 very interesting text from Sarah Chen, my former deputy. Complete chaos here. MS trying to access your risk management systems. Nobody can understand your notation system. Of course they couldn't. I had developed my own proprietary method of coding risk assessments over the years. It was perfectly logical if you understood the underlying mathematics, which Marcus very clearly didn't. I smiled, remembering his dismissal of my methods as unnecessarily complicated. He was about to discover just how necessary that complication had been. By afternoon, the first real tremors began. My phone buzzed with a message from my inside source at Meridian's trading desk. Emergency meeting called. MS trying to explain your hedging strategies to the board. Making 0 sense. Trading suspended on 3 major positions. I could picture it perfectly, Marcus standing in the same conference room where he'd fired me this morning, trying to explain complex risk management protocols he'd never bothered to understand. Probably using terms incorrectly, missing the subtle interplays between positions, not seeing the carefully constructed safety nets I'd built into every strategy. At 4:45 p.m., just before market close, another text from Sarah. MS just tried to unwind your E&G hedge structure. Nearly caused a $10 million loss before risk committee shut it down. Board member Jenkins asking questions. That would be Catherine Jenkins, the only board member with actual banking experience. She'd always understood my work, even as she'd been outvoted by Marcus's supporters. Now she would be starting to see the full picture. I spent that evening in my home office, a glass of expensive bourbon at my elbow, watching the pieces fall into place. My lawyer called to confirm that all my work at Meridian was properly documented and legally protected. My private banker reported unusual activity. Meridian's Treasury Department making inquiries about certain structured finance vehicles. They were starting to look, starting to dig, but they were already too late. Day 2 began with a series of increasingly urgent emails from Meridian's legal department, all marked strictly confidential, urgent response required. They wanted to discuss terms of my departure, wanted to ensure a smooth transition, wanted to maintain positive professional relationships. I archived each one without responding. Timing was crucial now, and silence was my most powerful weapon. Mid-morning brought more news from Sarah. MS called emergency risk committee meeting, tried to blame you for hiding critical information. Catherine Jenkins shut him down hard, demanded to see full credit facility documentation. I could almost hear Marcus's expensive shoes pacing across his office floor. He would be starting to feel it now, the first real tendrils of fear. His attempt to blame me would have backfired, making him look either incompetent for not understanding his own company's risk structures or negligent for not properly overseeing them. By lunch, the situation had escalated. William called from Somerset. Your replacement at Meridian just tried to access the credit facility documentation. Our compliance department, Following standard protocols informed them that any changes or access requests would need approval from the facility's controlling entity. And how did they react to that? I asked, already knowing the answer. Complete confusion. Apparently, Marcus Sterling himself got on the phone, demanding to know why he needed approval from anyone for his own company's credit line. I smiled, picturing Marcus's face turning that particular shade of red it got when things didn't bend to his will. I assume your team maintained proper protocol. Of course, they simply referred him to the standard documentation. Documentation that he signed, might I add, without reading. The afternoon brought more chaos. Meridian's stock price started to wobble as rumors of risk management issues circulated through the market. Nothing concrete, nothing actionable, just enough uncertainty to make traders nervous. Sarah's updates became more frequent. 2:15 p.m. MSN closed-door meeting with board. Lots of shouting. 3:30 p.m. Legal team requesting all risk management documentation from last 6 months. 4:45 p.m. Trading desk frozen. Nobody willing to take positions without your sign-off protocols. I spent the evening reviewing my documentation one final time, making sure every detail was perfect. Tomorrow would bring the quarterly review at Somerset, and with it, the moment Marcus Sterling discovered exactly what his hasty power play had cost him. My phone buzzed one final time before midnight. A message from Catherine Jenkins herself. Starting to understand what really happened here. Would like to meet privately tomorrow after the Somerset review. This isn't over. No, I thought, setting my phone aside and pouring another bourbon. It certainly isn't. Day 3 dawned clear and cold. I dressed carefully in a black Armani suit that cost more than most junior analysts made in a month. Image matters in finance, especially on days when you're about to turn the tables. I arrived at Somerset Bank 30 minutes early, using my new executive access card to enter through the private entrance. William met me in his office, looking impeccable and slightly amused. Marcus Sterling and his team just arrived, he reported. They're in the main conference room, trying to look confident. The risk committee is reviewing your USB data now. He paused, allowing himself a small smile. The timing of your firing couldn't have been better. Makes the whole reveal much more dramatic. I checked my reflection in his office window, adjusting my jacket slightly. Everything ready. All set. Standard quarterly review presentation, followed by the compliance update, ending with the ownership structure review. Should take about an hour to get to the big moment. I nodded, checking my watch. In exactly 60 minutes, Marcus Sterling would learn the true meaning of risk management, and I would be there to watch it happen. Shall we? William gestured to the door. I picked up my leather portfolio, the same one I'd had at my firing, and smiled. Time for phase 2. The conference room was packed when we entered through the private door behind the presentation screen. Through the one-way glass, I could see Marcus at the head of the Meridian team, trying to project confidence but fidgeting with his gold cufflinks, a tell he never knew he had. William took his seat at the head of the Somerset side. I stayed in the shadows behind the screen, watching, waiting. Right on schedule, the presentation began. Standard quarterly review materials, market positions, risk exposures. All the normal banking discussions that Marcus usually ignored. Then came the compliance update. I watched Marcus start to shift uncomfortably as the discussion turned to credit facility documentation. Watched him loosen his tie slightly as they discussed control structures. Watched his face start to pale as the words beneficial ownership appeared on the screen. And then, at exactly 10:17 a.m., it happened. The Somerset risk officer pulled up the ownership diagram of Meridian's credit facility. There, in clear corporate structure boxes, was the chain of control, leading directly to a holding company owned by one Emma Sullivan. The room went completely silent. Marcus's face, already pale, turned absolutely white. He started to stand, then fell back into his chair as the full implications hit him. He hadn't just fired an employee. He had fired the person who controlled his company's financial lifeline. Phase 2 was complete, and Phase 3 was about to begin. Part 3, The Reckoning. The next few moments in Somerset Bank's conference room felt like watching a slow-motion car crash. Marcus Sterling, the man who had so confidently fired me 3 days ago, sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of dawning horror as he stared at the ownership structure displayed on the screen. This can't be right, he stammered, his voice having lost all its previous authority. There must be some mistake. William Hayes, ever the consummate banker, smiled politely. I assure you, Mr. Sterling, there's no mistake. The documentation is quite clear. Your signature is on every page. That's when I stepped out from behind the screen, enjoying the way Marcus's eyes widened in shock. Perhaps, I said quietly, you should have read those papers more carefully before signing them. The room erupted in barely contained chaos. Meridian's legal counsel started frantically flipping through documents. Their CFO had turned an interesting shade of gray. And Katherine Jenkins, watching from the end of the table, had the smallest smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Marcus shot to his feet, his face now turning from white to red. This is manipulation. Fraud. I'll have you arrested for this. I placed my portfolio on the table, opening it with deliberate calm. Everything was done completely legally, Marcus. The ownership structure was clearly detailed in the documentation. Documentation that you signed, multiple times. I slid out a stack of papers, his signature prominent on each one. Would you like to review them now? He fell back into his chair, the fight visibly draining from him as reality set in. The entire room watched in silence as the implications became clear to everyone. The man who had publicly fired me 3 days ago had just discovered that I controlled his company's financial lifeline. William cleared his throat. Perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the terms of the credit facility's continuation. Marcus's head snapped up. Terms? What terms? Well, I said, taking a seat at the table. As the controlling entity of the credit facility, I have certain concerns about Meridian's current risk management practices, particularly in light of recent leadership decisions. Katherine Jenkins leaned forward. I believe the board would be very interested in hearing these concerns. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in professional decimation. I methodically laid out every flaw in Marcus's leadership. The ignored warnings, the reckless trading decisions, the dismantling of key risk protocols. Each point was documented, dated, and devastating. By the time I finished, Marcus looked like a man who had aged a decade in a day. But I wasn't done yet. So, I continued, here are my terms for maintaining the credit facility. I slid a document across the table. First, a complete overhaul of Meridian's risk management structure. Second, an independent audit of all trading positions taken under Mr. Sterling's direction. And third, I paused for effect, the immediate appointment of a new chief executive officer. Marcus exploded out of his chair. You can't do this. You can't just walk in here and demand. Actually, Katherine interrupted, she can. Without this credit facility, Meridian would be in breach of its regulatory capital requirements by tomorrow morning. The board cannot ignore that reality. She turned to me, professional respect evident in her eyes. Though I assume you have a candidate in mind for the CEO position? I smiled. Somerset Bank has already approved William Hayes for the role, should the board agree. His risk management experience would be invaluable. William nodded graciously as Marcus sputtered in disbelief. The man was watching his empire crumble, and there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Emergency board calls were made. Lawyers consulted. Documents prepared. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. Marcus Sterling had been removed as CEO, with a carefully worded press release citing strategic differences. William Hayes was appointed as interim CEO with full board approval. I was named Chief Risk Officer of both Meridian and Somerset, with oversight of a newly created risk management structure. And most satisfyingly, every person Marcus had fired or pushed out over the past 8 months was being contacted about returning to their positions. As the sun set over the city skyline, I stood in what had been Marcus's office, now temporarily mine until William took over next week. Katherine Jenkins knocked on the doorframe. That, she said, entering with 2 glasses of expensive scotch, was the most elegant corporate takedown I've ever witnessed. I accepted the glass with a small smile. Sometimes the best risk management strategy is to let others underestimate you. She laughed, settling into one of the leather chairs. You know, when Marcus first announced your firing, I almost intervened. Almost, but something in your expression that day told me to wait. I appreciate that, I said, taking a sip of scotch. It made the reveal much more effective. That it did. She raised her glass in a toast. to the woman who turned being fired into a corporate coup. Later that evening, as I packed up the last of Marcus's belongings from what would soon be William's office, Sarah appeared in the doorway. "The trading floor is celebrating," she reported, grinning. "Someone ordered champagne. And Marcus's old executive team is trying desperately to update their resumes before the mass exodus begins." I nodded, placing Marcus's pretentious motivational posters in a box. Change is healthy in corporate culture. Speaking of which, how do you feel about a promotion? I'll need a deputy chief risk officer I can trust. Her eyes widened. Seriously? But what about Somerset? I'll be overseeing risk for both institutions, part of the new partnership structure William and I designed. I smiled. It turns out getting fired was the best career move I never planned. That night, I stood at my penthouse window, watching the city lights twinkle below. My phone had been buzzing all day with congratulations, job offers, and interview requests. The Financial Times wanted to do a profile. Harvard Business Review was interested in a case study. And Marcus? He had been last seen clearing out his desk, his perfect suit wrinkled, his golden boy image tarnished beyond repair. I sipped my bourbon, savoring the warmth. In the end, it hadn't been about revenge. It had been about something far more important, proving that true power doesn't come from titles or corner offices. It comes from understanding the game better than anyone else, from seeing the moves others miss, from being willing to be underestimated until the perfect moment to strike. A text message lit up my phone. It was from William. "Board dinner tomorrow to celebrate the new partnership." Marcus's face when he realized who owned the credit line? Priceless. "See you at 8. I smiled, remembering that moment of revelation. Marcus had thought he was showing strength by firing me in front of everyone. Instead, he had staged the perfect backdrop for his own downfall. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The security guard, the same one who had escorted me out 3 days ago, grinned and waved me through. "Welcome back, Ms. Sullivan." I strode through the lobby, heels clicking on marble, employees nodding respectfully as I passed. The fear was gone from their eyes, replaced by something better, admiration. Not for my title or my power, but for how I had wielded it. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. Same suit, same portfolio, same calm expression. But something was different now. I wasn't just a risk manager anymore. I was living proof that sometimes the biggest risk is underestimating the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who understand that true power isn't about making noise, it's about making moves. The doors opened onto the executive floor, and I stepped out into my new reality. There was work to be done, systems to rebuild, trust to restore. But first, I had a story to tell the eager young analysts gathering in the conference room. A story about risk, about patience, and about the day a CEO learned that sometimes the person you're firing is the person you really can't afford to lose. Because in the end, the greatest victory isn't in proving others wrong. It's in proving yourself right. And I had done exactly that, one signature, one strategy, one careful move at a time. The conference room was packed when I entered. Young faces looked up eagerly, laptops open, ready to learn. I placed my portfolio on the podium and smiled. "Good morning," I began. "Today's lesson is about understanding risk. Real risk, the kind that doesn't show up on spreadsheets or risk assessments. The kind that comes from forgetting that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the cards." And as I launched into my presentation, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had turned getting fired into the ultimate power move. Perhaps I should send Marcus a thank you note. After all, he had given me the perfect stage for my greatest risk management triumph yet. But that could wait. Right now, I had an empire to run.